Today we're diving into a really powerful and maybe even a little radical idea from the philosopher Enrique Dussel. It's this. What if the very systems we build to be good are actually, in a way, designed to produce victims? Let's unpack his ethics of liberation. So, this quote? It's really the key to everything Dussel is talking about. That word dialectically, it basically just means that two opposites are deeply connected. That good can flip and actually become evil. But how? I mean, how on earth can a system designed for good end up creating so much harm? Well, that's the big puzzle we're going to tackle. All right, so before we can really get how wild Dussel's claim is, we kind of have to start with the basics. How do we usually think about ethics? I mean, for most of us, ethics is kind of a rule book, right? It's about laws, social norms, all the institutions we've set up. The whole point is to define what's good. And a good action is pretty much one that plays by those rules. Simple enough, that's our familiar starting point.
Okay, but this is exactly where Dussel comes in and just flips the whole thing on its head. He argues that this very system, this idea of the good, it has this dark side, a really serious unintended consequence. And he poses this really challenging question. What if the problem isn't that people are feeling to be good? What if the problem is the very definition of good that we're all using?
And that brings us to his most important concept, the victim. For Dussel, it's not a bug, it's a feature. He's saying that every good system, whether it's our laws, our economy, our moral codes, inevitably produces victims. Not by some freak accident, but as a direct result of how it works. So, if our starting point, these abstract principles, is broken, what do? Well, Dussel says we need to find a totally new foundation for ethics. We need to build it on entirely new ground. And for him, ethics doesn't start in some dusty old book or university classroom. No way. It has to start with the actual, real-life suffering person, the one who's getting the short end of the stick from the system. It's an ethics of flesh and blood, not just ideas. And look, this isn't some small, localized issue. Dussel says this is happening on a massive global scale. Just think about this number for a second. The richest 20% of us consume a whopping 82% of the world's goods. For Dussel, that's not just some dry economic statistic. It's the engine of a global system that is constantly, relentlessly creating victims. But, a huge number like that can feel a bit abstract. So Dussel makes it real. He points to a specific person, Rigoberta Menchú, the Nobel Prize-winning activist from Guatemala. He wants us to see her not just as one person, but as someone who exists at the crossroads of all these different systems of oppression. She's a woman in a man's world, she's indigenous in a post-colonial country, she's a peasant in a global capitalist economy. Each of those labels points to a different way the system creates victims. And it's crucial to see that these victims aren't just sitting there passively. Dussel points to movements like the Zapatistas in Mexico as these incredible moments where the hidden reality, the suffering that the system causes, just cracks wide open for everyone to see. So, this raises a huge question, right? Why? Why do our good systems keep doing this? For Dussel, the answer lies way back in a huge flaw in the way we've been told the story of philosophy and ethics itself. You know the story we usually get, right? It goes something like ancient Greece, and then, boom, modern Europe. But Dussel says, hold on, that's not the whole story, not even close. This timeline shows us that complex, ethical systems were thriving for thousands of years in places like Egypt and Mesopotamia, way before Plato was even born. The story did not start in Europe. So this leads Dussel to show us two totally different ways of looking at world history. On one side, you've got what he calls the interregional system. It's ancient, maybe 5,000 years old, and it has lots of different centers of power. Think China, India, the Islamic world. But then, about 500 years ago, that changes. We get the world system, which kicks off in 1492 and basically establishes Europe as the one and only center of the world. And here's maybe his most mind-blowing historical claim. He completely reverses the cause and effect we've all been taught. He says that modernity, the Enlightenment, modern science, philosophy, it wasn't the reason Europe became so dominant. No, it was the result. It was the fruit of the conquest and colonization of the Americas. That conquest is what gave Europe the money and power to pull ahead of everyone else. Okay, so Dussel has given us this really deep, heavy critique of history and ethics. But his philosophy isn't just about tearing things down. It's a very practical guide for building something new, for real transformation. So, the point of an ethics of liberation isn't just to feel sorry for people or to give to charity. That's not it. The real goal is to change the systems themselves, the very structures that create victims in the first place. It's all about action. And Dussel even gives us a roadmap for this, what he calls the praxis of liberation, which is just a fancy way of saying putting theory into practice. Step 1, the victims themselves have to become aware of their situation. Step 2, they need to critically analyze why it's happening. And step 3, they organize with others to actually change the system. So what's the end game here? What is good in this new system? Well, Dussel throws out the old rule book. For him, the highest possible good is, and I'm quoting him here, the full reproduction of the life of the victims. What that means, really, is that the whole point is to build a world where people who are suffering can finally live full, thriving lives. A world where the hungry have food, the oppressed are finally free. A world where the victim of yesterday gets to celebrate today. And that brings us to the final and maybe most important question. If Dussel's right, if ethics really has to start with the victim, then who are the victims in our world right now? And more to the point, who do we need to start listening to?